Hey, so glad you tuned into this episode of Navigate. If you have been listening into these episodes, you have probably figured out by now that most everything we talk about somehow comes back to the theme of transition. And so whether you're leaving something behind, adjusting to something new, or you're in the middle somewhere and trying to make sense of it all, my hope is that these conversations provide you with valuable tips and resources to engage with on your unique transition journey. We're going to jump right into a conversation I recently had with John Leverington. I first had the privilege of meeting John and his wife Becky when I was serving in Turkey. They have tons of experience serving the global worker community as member care providers, most recently through Olive Tree Counseling Center located in Antalya, Turkey. John is a licensed professional counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist, and licensed clinical social worker. He's also an approved supervisor for the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. John has responded to crisis events to assist teams and organizations to deal with the effects of trauma. He also works with teens, couples, and singles experiencing burnout, stress, depression, anxiety, loss, grief, and marital problems. He also consults with member care workers, human resource coordinators, and administrators regarding personal issues. John has over 30 years of counseling experience and the last 20 years in full-time volunteer work, first in Papua New Guinea and now as founding director of Olive Tree Counseling Center. John is married with 2 adult married children and 2 grandchildren. He enjoys running, hiking, photography, and experiencing new places. Again, thanks for joining me, and let's dive into my conversation with John Leverington. Welcome to Navigate. Welcome to my podcast, John. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So, we kind of go back to our time in Turkey. I think that's when we first met you guys. It may have been that my wife had conversations with you guys via email or something before that. But as far as face-to-face connection, that was during our time in Turkey, which ended in 2016.
You're right. I think that was the first direct in-person contact, but Eve and I had conversations for actually several years prior to that.
Yeah, I think that was going on.
And where to get a degree and just the whole process of her moving in that direction. We've appreciated her greatly and the contributions that she's made to Olive Tree Counseling Center in Antalya.
Yeah, so let's tell us more about that. Maybe we can just start by you telling us what you and your wife do and where that's taken you over the years and where you've ended up presently.
Well, the short version is that my wife Becky and I are both marriage and family therapists, both originally from Iowa, and had a interest in overseas work for many years, but due to family constraints, spent 20 years working in private practice, started a Christian counseling center called Keys to Living, and volunteered our time overseas for short-term trips. And then we were able to go full-time back in 1994 and went to Papua New Guinea to serve as counselors there with our 2 children. And when our daughter graduated from the international high school there, we were asked to move to Dallas, Texas, and I became the International Counseling Ministries Coordinator, working with people all over the world, and also responding to crisis incidents, which took me to the Middle East and Afghanistan and that part of the world, where I saw just a lack of resources throughout that whole region. And as a result of that, ended up moving to Turkey after some extensive research of where to locate. And we have now had Olive Tree Counseling Center in operation in Antalya for the last 6 years.
Great. Okay. Yes. And that's where Olive Tree Counseling Center is, when we were living in Turkey, is where my wife had the privilege of coming from time to time and serving on staff with you guys. Tell me why a counseling center in Turkey? I know you said you did some research, and you spent some time in the Middle East. Why did you land on Turkey?
Well, we contacted 10 of the largest organizations working in that part of the world, and it was agreed that Turkey was both a central and a strategic location to serve that whole region. And in fact, it's proven to be that and so much more. We have literally now seen people from Siberia to the Sahara of Africa and everywhere.
Wow.
So it surpassed our expectations. It's still in a part of the world that people come from. But as you know, Antalya is a very tourist destination that people can come and feel the freedom to go to a cafe or go for a jog or go to the beach or go to the mountains. And it provides both that sense of respite as well as a place to come to get some intensive counseling that we do usually in a 2-week module.
Okay. Yeah. And yeah. So I'm hearing you say it is definitely strategically placed as far as location. But yes, I'm in full agreement. It's a beautiful place to go. If you're going for counseling, what a place to be. Your surroundings are beautiful. It's just a great place to also rest and restore. We used to go there for some of our own company conferences, and took a little family time there in the Antalya area, and it's just a beautiful area.
Yeah, it also provides a hub for transportation. So one of our other primary goals is to provide crisis response and debriefing for trauma. So we can get to most places in that whole region of the world very quickly.
Yeah. And so I think you may have touched some on this. I don't know if there's anything you can add, obviously without going into detail, but kind of, I was going to ask, who are your clients, but it just sounds like they're just coming from, or where are they coming from? It sounds like they're coming from all over the world, which exceeded your expectations. Maybe at first you thought it would be a hub maybe mainly for Middle East, North Africa, that area, but it's expanded. People are coming from all over the place.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Uh-huh. And it continues to build each year.
Yeah. Great. And you said normally, tell me about as far as who can come, singles, families, what about with children, who's kind of would be candidates for being able to come and work with you guys?
Well, we only serve workers in that region of the world.
Yeah.
And we do see individuals, couples, and families. We have people who work with even preschool children, be it for trauma or other personal issues. We have a person who works with adolescents, another person that works with young adults. There are others of us on staff who work with couples. We do a lot of work with men around addiction issues, anxiety, depression issues for people. So a wide variety of things. We can see a whole family and work on all those things at the same time if necessary.
Great. Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about, I always like to hear maybe a particular transition, hear about a particular transition for you. Just maybe that stands out as especially challenging. For example, for me, when we went through a big transition leaving Turkey and knowing that we'd be coming back to the States more or less permanently, at least for this season that we're in, there was a big, it was a very, for me, it was challenging because we didn't have anything waiting, ahead of us that was really firmed up. It wasn't concrete. We had some hopes and dreams and desires, but there was really nothing there. But we were feeling led to step out and to move out and to make a big change. And so in that sense, for me, it was very challenging. And I know for depending on our situation, and the type of transition we're in, certain things stand out or can stand out as very or be highlighted as very challenging. Maybe could you tell me about a particular transition that makes it stand out as especially challenging for you? Whether that's, it can be past, something more current or fresh. What?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest and harder transition, because it wasn't expected, was our return from Papua New Guinea to Dallas, Texas. We had lived in Papua New Guinea in a very rural, isolated kind of environment. We're both originally from Iowa and grew up on farms in a rural community. So Dallas was really our first major city to live in. So it was the lack of anticipation of how difficult that would be, I think, that made it harder. And people had told us, there's churches on every corner. You won't have any problem fitting into a church. And it took us well over 2 years to find a church that we felt, contributed to us spiritually and was the kind of church that was inclusive of differences and that. And at the same time, we moved within 3 weeks from being overseas to moving all of our things to Dallas, taking our daughter off to Biola to start college. Our son went from a class of 20 to a class of 2,000. Looking for a place to live and, living temporarily, somewhere else. So I think it was just all the reentry things that really made it a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. You touched on expectations, and sometimes we just have no box to put it in. We like, for example, we're going to from a small town to a big city or vice versa. And we can do the research and we can think about it and talk about it. But until you actually land and get there, you have no sense or feel for community and what that in all entails, what challenges will be presented there. So it sounds like some of those things hit you pretty hard when you landed in was it Dallas?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. One thing I've been convinced of now over the years of having done this several times and also in counseling people is it doesn't matter how equipped you are, how prepared you think you are, how skilled or experienced or capable or competent a person is in doing your job or ministry. If you don't transition well, and have negative effects on your life and on your family and on a whole team.
Yes. Yeah. So true. Yep. And so what did help you guys ultimately transition well in that case? with all of its surprises and challenges and all of that, what were some things that helped you ultimately get through that transition?
I think for all of us, both for my wife and I, as well as for our children, was finding people who had similar life experiences, having lived overseas.
Mm-hmm.
For my son, the advantage of being in a place like Dallas was having other TCKs, MKs who had experienced the same sort of life.
Yeah.
Could relate to each other in ways that other students couldn't. And that was equally true for Becky and I as well.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we were in a community where that was possible. So
right,
just finding those people, your values, your outlook, your perspective, the things that you consider important just have changed as a result of how God has worked in your life and how you see God working in other people's lives overseas.
Yeah, that is so true. Yeah, so that connection, you were able to make some of those connections, like-minded people who kind of could relate, maybe had similar experiences.
Yeah.
And our transition was at least this most recent one of coming back from overseas was kind of the opposite of yours in terms of we left a city of 18 million people or about there, Istanbul, Turkey, to come to a small town of 3,000 in Northern California. And so we found it very challenging to connect with people who understood, who could relate, who had similar experiences. We found ourselves doing more, Skype calls and things to coworkers and friends overseas for a season, because that was the way we could get that input, get that connection at that time. And even for our daughter, coming new into high school here in the States, nobody, whether that was at school or in her youth group, had anything remotely similar to her experience. So yeah, for a season, she was also Skyping regularly with her girlfriends back in Istanbul and just trying to reach out for support in any way you can. So it does make it more challenging when you feel more isolated and not surrounded, or those kinds of people aren't as accessible. Yeah,
and it's not trying to duplicate where you've been, or
right.
I think of transition, or would actually even define it, as the internal adjustment to the external changes.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that have changed in my world, but how I adjust to that, how I adapt to that, how flexible I am in dealing with that.
That's
the difference in terms of how well I adapt to this new place.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I like that definition, the transition being an internal adjustment to the external
change. Yep.
Yeah. Change. Yeah. Good. So, we talk, maybe kind of transition here to how, we talk about self-care or soul care, just spiritual rhythms, whatever language you want to use around some of that to maintain and, spiritual vitality and health. And so in the work we do with cross-cultural workers, we talk a lot about that. And transition presents its own unique set of challenges around that. How have you seen transition present a challenge in this area as you help people navigate change?
Well, there's several factors that I think of, but one that I think is important is just recognizing the transition being an important period to be open to what God wants to reveal or show you or teach you. Mm-hmm. I've been struck recently by the story of Christ, wanting to leave the solid ground of where he was, mm-hmm. And being surrounded by people and asking for the disciples to accompany him in making the transition from where he was on solid ground, mm-hmm. across, the water to escape and get away to another place on mm-hmm. the other side, mm-hmm. for that kind of rest and refreshment.
Yeah.
But what strikes me about that whole story is what was important, turned out to be important, is not the destination, not getting to the other side, but the discovery of the disciples in making the transitions on the water to the other side in the midst of the storm, where some of the disciples are, criticizing Jesus. Some of the disciples are, I'm sure, frantically trying to save themselves from being capsized and drowned, putting all their effort into working harder. There are others who were questioning Jesus, don't you care about what's happening to us? And I think of all those same things in the midst of a transition, especially a transition that wasn't asked for.
Yeah.
Or that is a traumatic experience of some sort that necessitates, transition. And we ask all those kinds of questions about, where's God in the midst of this? Mm-hmm. What is happening? Or for others in the transition, in the midst of the transition, trying to plan everything, trying to get everything in order, and not that we shouldn't do that, but mm-hmm. but the work of it becomes the central focus.
Right.
And so I like to think of that story as a good transition story, mm-hmm. about what you can discover about yourself and what you can discover about God in the midst of the transition. And it's not just about getting to the other side. Mm-hmm. It's not just the transition is not just a destination to get to, but can be a discovery of so much more.
Yeah.
In the process.
Yeah, that's good. And that can really be maybe sometimes hard to hear for some people who are task driven and goal driven and want to get to the other side, but so important to hear that God has an agenda even in that in between place, and I love that analogy and that story of on the water being, not solid ground, but it's still purposeful, maybe even more purposeful in terms of the timing of it. Yeah.
But in the midst of the chaos and in the midst of the storm, that Jesus seeks to still meet us there. And how that can affect relationships as well, in the midst of that kind of transition. For just like the disciples, I'm sure the ones who were trying to pull the mast down and trying to bail the water were saying, why aren't you helping?
Yeah.
Trying to keep this afloat, and right. Those others who were, at Jesus' feet or shaking him to wake up and, shaking their fist at God and saying, do something here. We're sinking. Mm-hmm. So it can affect relationships in expecting others to be working as hard as I am to get through this, or expecting others to ask, bigger questions rather than just be focused on getting through this and about, where's God or what's God trying to do in the midst of this.
Yeah.
And And for me, on a personal level, that kind of personal difference was made real to me in our marriage relationship. On our honeymoon, even. We hadn't even gotten through the first day of our honeymoon because we were driving from Iowa to Colorado to do a ski honeymoon. And my idea of driving was to discover all the things that we could see along the way. And Becky's idea of a honeymoon was getting to our destination so we can start the honeymoon.
Right. Okay.
So I've always
from day one
taken that as a good lesson on the differences in being a discovery or a destination kind of driver, and all of us have those kind of differences in our families or one person over the other.
Right.
But recognizing the value in both, and that those are differences, in how we look at things and do things.
Yeah. And I'm sure that comes out in a lot of, when I do, for example, when I do transitions coaching with couples around a big transition they're making, that those kinds of differences are often highlighted. And I'm sure it's the same with you in terms of the folks that you work with. And, but just that awareness of how the other individual is wired, or our kids even, it affects TCKs obviously as well, and how they are wired, and are they destination, enjoy the journey, let's get as much out of the actually, crossing to the other side as, or are they kind of focused on getting to the other side? How are we all as a family unit, as individuals, wired, and how do we lean, in what direction?
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. But that process, of transition, it's not just about the destination. It's also about the process. Of going through this, and going through it together. If we're a couple or as a family, or if we're single and going through it with a partner or someone else.
Yes. Yeah. Good.
There's a great quote by Jeff Mannion in his book, The Land Between, Finding God in Difficult Transitions. He says, often God leads us through the land we most want to avoid in order to produce the fruit we most desperately desire.
Yeah.
That just sums it up so well.
Yes.
We want to avoid the difficulties, maybe even the hardships of the transition.
Right.
But it's often that very process that God uses it to produce the fruit, that we really need. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, for me, I'm just thinking of my own personal experience of transition. I learned, it forced me to kind of, as I was going through a prolonged transition, it forced me to think creatively, about learning to abide in Christ in new and creative ways, maybe ways I wasn't used to before, to be able to, get the most out of the journey as I could. And because in that quote, you talk about fruit, and God is looking for fruit. And that's what that's what he desires. And he knows what to take us through, and how to get us to that place of greater fruitfulness. So I love that quote.
Yeah. And it's often in that between worlds process that comes about in the midst of things that we don't particularly like.
Right.
I've called it the 5 C's of being in between worlds of, it's chaos, it's confusion, it's criticism, it's conflict, and fear of capsizing, of not surviving. And those are the 5 C's that I see in the story of Jesus and the disciples as well.
All right. What are there any other some key concepts or strategies you address while walking with people through transition seasons? You mentioned forced change, kind of that biblical example you gave of Jesus and the disciples on the water. Some of that is I think can relate to being change that's forced upon us. So either related to that or anything else around transition, maybe another key concept or strategy you would talk about in your workshop that you do.
Well, I think there's several aspects that are required in transition. One is honesty with ourselves in terms of acknowledgement of feelings. You know, the disciples had lots of feelings of abandonment, of fear, of confusion, anxiety, all those kinds of things. And I think for us as well, even if it's a transition we're looking forward to, honestly acknowledging, you know, the anxiety about starting something new, or will I be able to accomplish this, or will God really show up or come through? I think one of the things that we often aren't good at in faith communities is that kind of honesty with ourselves. Again, we focus on the destination and all the things we expect, you know, are going to happen, as opposed to honestly acknowledge and be able to express to God and to somebody else, you know, that we trust, you know, what this is really like for me. You know, going through this.
Yeah, that's good. The honesty piece. I remember I mentioned earlier about some of the challenges for our most recent big transition that I was navigating, and it was some of this was around, you know, there was no plan beyond the actual move, other than let's get settled in and figure things out, really. So I think I had a lot of insecurity around that, because for 20 years we were overseas workers who had financial support pretty much guaranteed. I mean, it is, you know, there is some, you know, wondering, you know, from month to month, well, how is it going to work out? But pretty much I felt secure in that. And, you know, some people ask, well, you were cross-cultural workers, you know, how did you even have financial security? Well, we didn't have a lot, but at least we knew what we had was monthly. God was faithfully providing for us. And so that was a big piece for me, just the lack of financial, you know, security and not knowing where that would come from. But I think bigger picture for me was just this: I needed to be honest about some of those, like you're saying, some of the feelings that I was experiencing, a way to process that. So processing it, telling my story, sharing openly my feelings around that was huge for me, but didn't come naturally. I really had to work at that. So I can relate. I guess I'm just saying I can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, I think in relationship to that, another aspect that I think is required in any kind of transition is grieving. You know, and that's another thing that we don't do well often as Christians, in being able to leave things behind. I had my first counselor mentor of sorts was Virginia Satir many years ago, and one of her quotes was, "You cannot move forward without leaving something behind." And often we're always looking forward to what what we're going to do or what God is going to do, and not good at grieving the losses of the things that we are leaving behind.
Yeah.
And that does take time. It does take reflection. And it takes awareness. And it also takes faith, that are things that are important. And we need to leave well.
Yes.
And I actually came up with the 5 Ds for ending.
Oh, okay. Man, we're getting some good stuff from your workshop here. So, okay, what are the 5 Ds?
The 5 Ds are needing to disengagement, the loss or sense of disidentification, things I've identified with, thought of myself as my own identity. It can be disenchantment, that things haven't turned out the way I'd hoped they would have turned out. And ending and starting a transition is also disorienting. It's not clear what I'm going into or what's going to happen. And especially the last one, especially if it's a non-asked for or traumatic kind of transition, is disbelief, that this is happening, that this is really what I'm having to do.
Disbelief, yeah. Okay. So
but all of those involve grief. I guess I would overlay grief and loss.
Yeah.
And grieving those things.
Yeah.
That's the important aspect of that.
So those are, and that can be a lot to grieve, especially if there's lots of relationships and connections and things, that are rooted, we have the roots go down deep sometimes, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And what are some ways that you encourage people to engage the process of transition? These are these things, for example, that we need to grieve the loss over, just in you explaining these 5 Ds. But what are some practical ways people can engage that process, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I think, asking yourself those kinds of questions, what are the things that are ending, and how am I experiencing that? How's this impacting me, my thoughts about what I imagine God would accomplish or what I imagine God would do? How is it affecting my own identity of how I think of myself? And again, provides the opportunity to evaluate myself in the light of how God sees me, in the light of who I am in Christ. In the situation. So taking the time to reflect on some of those things. It could be through journaling. It could be through conversation with a trusted friend. The opportunity to sit down and just share those kinds of things with somebody else. I think for if you've lived in a place or had a home, being able to reflect on that home. Recently went through a change of office, from the initial office of where we were, which was a wonderful place. And if you were there, it had a great, incredible view of the Taurus Mountains overlooking the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I was there, and that was a beautiful, beautiful place. Beautiful view.
I took time. Everything had been moved out. all the walls, were put back the way they originally were. It was just an empty shell. But I could go from room to room and remember things about each of those spaces of things that had happened in ways God had shown up, and give him praise for that. And whether it's a home or whether it's an office, having the opportunity to do that sort of reflection, it help me put in perspective, leaving that place, help me process it and be able to move forward.
Right. Yeah.
In ways that I couldn't have if I hadn't taken that time.
Yeah. 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 And I like some of the things you're saying here, because some of the things that you can do, reflecting into, personal reflection, introspection, journaling, conversations with trusted individuals, that maybe we as you take a transition season, we'll be doing one thing more than the other, but then we'll kind of move into more processing with people, or we'll do more journaling. But it's not that it has to always be the same for every individual. I think that what I like about these suggestions is that they're, depending on how we're wired, there are different ways we can process that. And I know that for me, I can easily sit and reflect and one-on-one with the Lord and ask some of these questions, and yet I don't always see the need, and it is a need, but I don't always recognize it. I'm not always aware of that to actually process with somebody else. And so I have to step out intentionally to do that a little more. It takes a little more effort on my part. So I guess, depending on kind of how we're wired and how we lean,
Yeah, I think anything that you can come up with as a way to celebrate the things that have been done, a way to mark, some of those endings. The Israelites built the stone marker. Whether it's having the picture of something, or pictures of people, or whether it's having the special literal stone or rock or something from this place, that I want to take with me to mark what God has done, or what God has done in my life, or just as a remembrance.
Yeah.
This time and place.
Yeah. And sometimes those, even those visual reminders or tangible things we can touch and take with us are even helpful. So I love what you're saying there. What are, maybe just moving it kind of as we look at wrapping up our conversation today, what are some non-negotiables for you in terms of habits and practices that really don't change even through the most chaotic transitions, or those kind of habits and practices that you have established that really don't change, and that you can in one way or another practice through transition?
I think that's a good point in terms of trying to maintain as much of a routine as possible. That's especially important for children, that when the furniture is moving or disappearing, as you're leaving or packing up, or suitcases are being filled, there's a level of anxiety and concern that builds, especially for children, but for all of us. We're inconvenienced by the loss of those things in our lives, be tangible or intangible. So being able to do some of those routine things, maintaining that is going to be really helpful. For me, one of the things I do is run. and sometimes in those kind of transition periods, it feels like, do I really have time for this? Mm-hmm. But maintaining that is part of my daily schedule in terms of exercise or physical activity. Maintaining, practices of worship or times with God, and taking time, as a family or as a couple, especially to just have together and maintain even just a meal schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That even the most mundane of those kinds of things, to give a sense of stability and a sense of routine, become important parts of ending, as well as getting reestablished, somewhere, finding ways to do that as well.
That's good. Yeah. I remember I actually had a conversation with my oldest daughter for one of these podcast episodes. And that's one of the things she brought up when we were talking about what are some things that were constants in your life that helped you as a third culture kid living overseas, lots of change, lots of transition all the time. And she said, which I didn't even think was made a big impression, but it was family meals that we maintained those meals together around the table. We didn't just grab a plate and sit in front of the TV or something. We actually maintained those even through lots of change. We maintained those times together. So I thought that was encouraging. And I think, like you're saying, there are things that we can do both on both sides and in between the transition that certainly are helpful for maintaining that kind of stability for our families as well.
Yeah, I definitely think those practical kinds of ways that we can maintain a sense of spiritual sense of God's presence, exercise, social, relational parts of our lives, the emotional and psychological things that we can do. Those 5 aspects of life are things that we can still do. It may have to be altered in some kind of way,
right?
The circumstances, but each of those become important parts of managing a transition well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, what advice, John, would you give? This is a question I like to ask. What advice would you give to your younger self, particularly as it relates to what we've been talking about today, maybe navigating transitions or something around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the amount of time spent, anxious moments, worry during those transition times. You had a lot more faith than I did when you said, finances wasn't a concern. I had worked for 20 years, usually 2 or 3 different positions at a time. So when we went overseas for the first time, totally dependent on support, it was 2 years before I quit following the classified ads, for possible jobs if this didn't work out.
Yeah. Plan B.
So, the amount of time, spent in anxious thought, and the amount of time just trying to work it all out or figure it all out on my own.
Yeah.
Without assistance. I mean, those would be the two main things I would tell my younger self, to do differently.
Yeah, great advice. Yeah. And now on the other side of that, you you and your wife are helping others, and I believe, navigating these transitions, and that it's important to stay connected, rooted and in Christ during these times, and how just that alone, staying rooted in Him, and as that firm foundation for our lives, can reduce so much of the worry and anxiety and the stress related to the unknown, and whatever does tend to cause us anxiety. And transition is a big contributor to anxiety, and it's definitely we need to be aware of that. So great advice. Yeah.
Three things that I've come to follow and I would recommend to anyone in terms of what transitions require. And the first one is following God's lead without always knowing where He's sending us. We don't always know what the outcome is going to be, but we're looking to and wanting to follow Him. The second one is timing, waiting for God's timing, without knowing when that will come, when the transition will end in some cases, waiting for a visa or not being able to get back into a country, are waiting for God's timing and don't always know when that will come. And the third one is trusting God's purpose, without having to understand why. And I'm sure you and I and many other people who are listening probably have lots of examples of that, that we trust God has a purpose even when it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. That's a big one. Those are great. Following God's lead, and trusting in His timing, and the waiting on that timing of His, and then trusting His purpose through that. All of those kind of remind me of the call of Abram. When God said to him, "I want you to leave your country and your people and go to the land I will show you." He didn't show him all every little detail. It was a real trust lesson to step out and to wait for God's timing in that process. So yeah, good tips for staying grounded. Yeah. Through transition. Well, this has been great, John. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I just really appreciate you and Becky and what you guys are doing and contributing to the global community, using your skills and gifts, and bringing so much to support global workers around the world. And we just really appreciate all that you guys do. And how can cross-cultural workers or their sending agencies connect with you as a resource? Kind of as we wrap up today, how can we leave people with some guidance on how to connect with you in terms of Olive Tree Counseling Center and the services you guys provide?
The easiest way, and how most people find us, is through our website, olivetreecounselingcenter.org, O-R-G. You can find all the information about us there, and there's also a contact button, that will come to our office, with questions for consultation or counseling or crisis debriefing. Can reach us there.
Great.
And one other note that I wanted to add is a friend of ours, Connie Beefus, who also serves on our board, has written it's actually a workbook titled "Sojourners: A Guide to Thriving Cross-Culturally." But it's all about dealing with loss and grief and the kinds of things we've been talking about associated with transition. So she has a wealth of experience and knowledge from her own life that she shares in that, but it's been a very helpful guide for people going through transition.
Great. Sounds like a great resource. So is that available on Amazon? People can find it as an ebook, or
yes.
how? Great. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
All right. Wonderful, John. Thank you so much again for your just sharing your insights and your stories and some of the things that I just really believe are going to help our listeners today in terms of navigating transition. And do give our love to your wife, Becky. And I'm sure that, we're looking forward to reconnecting with you very soon, most likely on your turf in Antalya in the near future.
Well, that's great, Tim. And the same to Eve. And congratulations on the wedding for your son and new daughter-in-law.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right, John. Be blessed.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Well, these were some great takeaways from my conversation with John Leverington today. Some of the takeaways for me come in the form of questions. Am I more driven by the destination or the discovery? What am I learning during the in-between time? Can I trust in God's timing? Can I trust His purpose without knowing why? Maybe some other questions came up for you. Processing transition is something we don't want to try to do alone. And if you're in the middle of a challenging transition, let me encourage you to reach out for support. You can learn more about how to work with me as a coach at EncompassLifeCoaching.com. That wraps up another episode of Navigate. Thanks for joining me. I've been your host, Tim Austin. And if this has been helpful to you, would you mind rating the podcast, writing a review, and sharing on social media? Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your sending organization that there's some great resources to be had on this podcast. I really appreciate that. And of course, you can always subscribe so that you're sure to get in on the next episode, and I'll catch you next time.